Hi. It is Sunday, June the 28th, and we are now 6 months into dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that means we are 6 months closer to having this thing knocked out. Quick update, as we always do, on just where we are with the numbers. Unfortunately, every direction that we look in terms of globally, nationally, the state and local levels, the numbers are not encouraging. I'm sure you've seen in the news that at a global level, the numbers continue to climb. 2 Sundays ago, the daily increase in cases was at about 129,000 new cases a day. Last Sunday, looking at the previous 7 days, the average had jumped up to 150,000 new cases per day. And this week, we've been seeing 167,000 new cases per day. So that continues to climb. The death rate is climbing with it. It always lags a week or two behind, but this is not just an increase in testing. The death rate had gotten down to about 4,200 or 4,300 deaths per day. It's now climbed up to about 4,800 per day and continuing to climb. The more concerning numbers are in the United States. More than 30 states are seeing significant increases in the numbers of cases. And for us as a whole, as a country, what we had seen is that the numbers had become quite stable from Mother's Day till mid-June. For 5 solid weeks there, the number of new cases per day in the United States had hovered right around 22 to 23,000 cases per day and had stayed right in that range for 5 weeks. But 2 weeks ago, that number began to climb, so that last Sunday, the new total for the previous 7 days on a daily basis had jumped up to almost 27,000 new cases per day. That number has changed in a week's time, so that today, the previous 7 days averaged together, we're seeing an increase of more than 37,000 new cases per day. That's a 67% increase in 2 weeks' time of new cases in the U.S., and that is not a result just of additional testing. We've seen a 38% increase over the last 1 week, and the really telling sign is that we've seen a 40% increase in COVID-19 deaths over the case of the past week. Locally, the numbers are not much better. In the state of Alabama, numbers have jumped up really significantly in the last 2 weeks. We saw over 5,500 new cases of COVID-19 in Alabama this past week. And unfortunately, for those of us who live in Baldwin County, we're finally starting to see the numbers climb up here. They had stayed very stable. Last Sunday, the count for the previous week had only been 44 new cases. The count for the previous week now, as of today, is 134 new cases. That's an increase of more than 200%. So we're finally actually seeing an increase in our area. It is a cause for us to be concerned and to begin to take action to guard ourselves against what's going on. And it's amazing that we're still having to have these conversations at this point, but there has been so much effort that's been put forth, particularly on social media, to just continue to pass along inaccurate information and things that sound scholarly or sound like they've been well researched, to try and say the disease isn't really that deadly or it's not spreading as widely as people say, when the truth of the matter is it has killed more than 500,000 people in the world. It is continuing to grow rapidly. It's growing faster now than it has at any other point in time, particularly in the Americas. The United States and Mexico and North America and almost all of South America, as well as Russia, Pakistan, India, the Middle East, South Africa. Those are the real hot spots. But for us in the U.S., the Deep South, Florida, all of the Southeast, all the way to Texas, and even Arizona and California are seeing rapid increases, and we need to be alert to this. Don't believe the bogus stuff that's being reproduced to say it's not as bad as what they're telling you. It is very serious. The situation that we're watching right now unfold, it reminds me of kind of a goofy story, a true story that happened when I was in middle school. Middle school that I attended, there was a family that had multiple kids in school. One of them was my classmate, and they had a farm, and they had a problem on their farm of a lot of rats. And these rats had just a huge network of tunnels underneath the yard, into the barn, underneath the house. And my friends in that family came up with a plan for how they were going to get rid of the rats. And they didn't consult with their parents first. They just went home and came up with a bright idea of getting a big can of gas and going around to each of these rat holes and pouring in lots of gasoline. And when they had emptied that, they struck a match and dropped it in the hole. And for just a few seconds, it seemed like a really good idea as fire raced through those tunnels and was getting to where the rats were hiding. What they could not predict and didn't recognize was about to happen was almost disastrous, because after just a few moments, Flaming rats ran out of every hole in every direction, into the barn, under the house, into the hay. They nearly burned down the house and the barn were their bright idea for getting rid of the rats. They responded quickly enough and aggressively enough that they saved the house and they saved the barn. But I tell you that silly story because it really is analogous to the situation that we're facing right now. Rats are not the problem, but they are sort of the picture in this story of the problem. It's not rats gathering in tunnels, it's human beings gathering in places like beaches, bars, restaurants, clubs, and parties. And they're doing it in a way where they're not social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're not using any kind of precautions. And the people who are doing it, primarily the largest numbers, are younger people. People in their teens and 20s and even in their 30s and 40s. And we know that this is the case because the new cases of COVID-19, the average age of those who are diagnosed over the last 2 weeks has dropped by more than 10 years over the last 2-week span. It's the younger generation that have decided this is not a threat, this is not that bad, we're not going to die from it, and they've gone back into these places like rats hiding in the tunnels. And it really started the last half of May, particularly around Memorial Day weekend. And for several weeks, it looked like, see, it's not causing a problem. The numbers aren't jumping. Nothing's really happening. But about 10 days ago, it's like a lit match got dropped into that first rat hole. And suddenly, flaming rats are appearing everywhere. But here's the thing. These flaming rats, it's not like they've got regular gasoline on them. If you've ever seen a fire that's caused by the gasoline that they use in Indy cars and those races, that's mostly ethanol. And if you've ever seen a fire from one of those, you can't see the flames. I remember years ago watching a driver who got doused with the fuel and then set on fire, and the camera caught it. He's on fire and he's trying to get people to put him out, but nobody could see the flames because it's 98% ethanol. Well, these burning rats have that kind of fire on them. When it spreads to the house or it spreads to the barn, it's going to be a very real fire, and it'll be flames that you can see, but you can't see the fire on the rats right now because it's young people who aren't getting noticeably sick. You can't see the disease on them, but they're carrying it to the house and the barn. And I'll tell you what the house and the barn are in the United States today. The house is the senior adult population, and the barn is those of all ages who have pre-existing conditions. And I want to tell you, when the flames get to them, they're not going to be invisible. It's going to be very visible. People are getting sick and people are dying. And by the time we get a couple of weeks into July, if we don't do something now, it's going to be a full-blown 4-alarm fire. That's what the numbers are indicating. For a little while, the death numbers probably won't climb at such an alarming rate because it's the younger part of the population that's catching the disease so rapidly. But understand how this is going to work. Those young people go home to families. They visit their parents. They visit their grandparents. They spend time around their bosses and people of a different generation. And in those exchanges, this thing's going to be passed on to people who are going to exhibit the disease. What I'm telling you is this. The greatest threat to you, if you're a senior adult or if you have a pre-existing condition or you're just any age or stage of life and trying to protect yourself, the greatest threat is probably not that masked stranger that you meet on the aisle in the grocery store. The greatest threat to you, unfortunately, in the coming weeks is probably going to be your children or your grandchildren, your nieces or nephews, people that you love and who may be totally unknown to you are going out to parties and to bars or restaurants and interacting at social levels where they're not practicing social distancing and doing the things to keep themselves safe. And unfortunately, they're going to bring the fire to the house and the barn if you and I aren't careful. As I've told you before, we're at a place you cannot trust the government or anybody else to take care of you. Right now, you're going to have to make decisions for a span of probably another 6 to 12 months where you protect yourself in many instances from your own family members. I'm not trying to be insulting when I compare the younger generation to burning rats running around. The truth of the matter is nobody's trying to hurt anyone else, but there's just a lot of thoughtless behavior that's going on, and we're each going to have to use some caution if we're going to guard ourselves and make it to a time when there is a vaccine and when there's real help and we're able to see this thing begin to die off. We're going to get through this, but we're going to have to use some wisdom and caution to do this. I want to encourage you, lean into God, pray for His intervention, but at the same time, do your part, work like it's all up to us. I'm Mark Price reminding you we're going to get through this. You remember to stay safe, stay in touch, and always know that you are loved.